I'm speaking to you today from the nuclear-free city of Tacoma Park, Maryland, which actually just passed the Back from the Brink resolution last Wednesday. It took a couple of months, actually several months to get it done, but it's done. So we're going to add our name to that list. I'm going to preface my remarks today to say that while I do work at Beyond Nuclear, I'm speaking in my personal capacity, and that's because I'm going to touch on some political issues. And while we remember the heinous acts of August 6th and 9th, 1945, try to bring it into the present context. So, as they say, all opinions are my own. So today, almost 80 years after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the first and only time nuclear weapons were used in war, but not the only time they've been used on human beings, there are still so many questions, debates, and myths about why the US bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The discussion about whether or not the US actually needed to drop the bombs at all has been well exercised, and you're probably familiar with the various arguments. It ended the war and saved American lives. That's the convenient narrative. But there is another far more compelling one, that A, the US needed to demonstrate the power of its bombs, and B, it did so to send a warning to Stalin. It's clear from unclassified documentation that after the bombing of Hiroshima, Japan's generals were willing to fight on. They'd seen worse casualties during the firebombing of Tokyo. And it's also clear that Japan surrendered when Stalin declared war, but that the country was preparing to face the inevitability of surrender regardless. So far from saving lives, what the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings achieved was to launch the Cold War and a nuclear arms race that has led to an untold death toll between the actual atomic tests that followed and the radioactive fallout that we all live with today. But let's return to why it was apparently so easy to annihilate other human beings in this way. To do that, we need to look forward to Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, all communities who do not look like us, and where women, children, babies, the elderly were wiped out with impunity. In the same way, on those two fateful days, the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were simply non-combatants who were sacrificed to demonstrate the imperial power of a country that didn't even have an emperor. But we also need to look back at where the US sourced its uranium and where it tested its nuclear weapons. 80% of the uranium for the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs came from what is now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, then the Belgian Congo. Some came from Dene land in northern Canada. Later, it was mined domestically on Native American land. Again, we're looking mainly at communities of color and indigenous peoples. And of course, we just have to look at where the US tested its nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. Remember that terrible Merrill Eisenbud quote? While it is true that these people do not live the way Westerners do, civilized people, it is nevertheless also true that these people are more like us than mice. That's a US government official talking. He was the director of the US Atomic Energy Agency's Health and Safety Laboratory. It was another vile and immoral experiment, and the US government pretty much admitted it was. Here's what Eisenbud also said in 1956 of the people they left behind on Rongelap for 2 days after the March 1, 1954 Castle Bravo blast, before evacuating them, and who were returned there by the Americans just 3 years later, assured there was no further danger from radiation. Here's his quote. That island is by far the most contaminated place on Earth, and it will be very interesting to get a measure of human uptake when people live in a contaminated environment. And of course, the US also tested its nuclear weapons on Western Shoshone land in Nevada. And then there are the proxy wars, where US conventional weapons do the killing, some tipped with depleted uranium, even if American soldiers aren't firing them, toppling governments in places like Chile and Guatemala, and of course, most horrifically today, in Gaza. There's an obvious pattern here, and it has a name, and that name is racism. Some of us are still in recovery, or maybe we will never be, from the truly heinous display on Capitol Hill on July 24th, a day that should live in infamy, just as August 6th and 9th should. We witnessed a war criminal, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, disgracefully embraced and applauded by members of our Congress, speak for an hour as if the genocide his government is perpetrating in Gaza wasn't happening. He never mentioned Palestinians by name because to Netanyahu, there are no Palestinians, only Hamas. So there, the collateral damage to rescue 4 Israeli hostages is 300 Palestinian lives. To take out one enemy, dozens more. The link here to everything that has gone before is dehumanization. It's what drove the new Americans to massacre Native Americans. It allowed for slavery. And it was rooted in Nazi Germany's elimination of Jews, gypsies, the disabled, and homosexuals. It worked during World War II when the Japanese were painted literally as rats on posters and described as spiders, scorpions, and, said US General Joseph Stilwell, bow-legged cockroaches. This resulted in Americans cheering the dropping of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs and the persistent belief that this atrocity was somehow necessary. Similar tropes were used to dehumanize the Vietnamese people during the American war in their country, and today it is the turn of Palestinians, labeled Amalek, the people who, according to the Old Testament, must be wiped from the face of the earth. There is, of course, another genocide going on today that almost no one talks about, and it's happening in the Congo. And the Congo really provides the through thread for this whole story. When the US sourced uranium from the Congo for its atomic bombs, it did so undercover using spies and secret codes. Industrial diamonds was the term often substituted for uranium. Congo uranium, by far the richest uranium ore in the world, had to be clandestinely transported to the US because it was needed for the Manhattan Project, still so secret that almost everyone involved in the Congo operation had no idea what the uranium was actually for. The operation was also undercover and disguised because the biggest fear was that Nazi Germany might also try to plunder the Congo supply. And it was a fear grounded in reality because Germany did need that uranium. Perhaps Werner Heisenberg did know what he was doing and chose not to do it. Or maybe Germany did not get the bomb simply because it did not have access to a sufficient supply of high-grade uranium, although it's likely that they did indeed get their hands on at least some of the Congo supply already stored in Belgium. At any rate, Germany did not get anywhere close to making the bomb and surrendered before the US was ready to use theirs. And once it was, they needed to test it on someone, and so we know what happened next. But back in the Congo, the conditions under which uranium was mined at Shinkolobwe were appalling. Just as Native Americans were unprotected and uninformed in the US, so too were the Congolese. The uranium was king, and they were the expendable subjects. So coveted was Congo's uranium that, according to later revelations by an MI6 operative, the UK Foreign Intelligence Service, Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected prime minister after Congo got its independence, was assassinated in 1961, just months after coming to power, not only due to fears that he would lead the country into communism, but also over uranium. That's because no sooner was Lumumba elected than Katanga province, home to the Shinkolobwe mine, seceded from the country. Lumumba needed help to quell the rebellion, and finding none at the UN, eventually he turned to the Soviets. American and British intelligence feared Lumumba would hand over complete access of the Congo uranium to Khrushchev. His fate was sealed. But the US is not the only country that relied on the Congo for the survival of its nuclear weapons, and has done so, the survival of its nuclear weapons program. Israel has nuclear weapons and has done so since the late 1950s, even though incredibly it's still not officially recognized as a nuclear weapons state. In November 1968, when France stopped supplying uranium to Israel after the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, Israel embarked on a daring scheme to get uranium out of the Congo, involving multiple countries, ships, and subterfuge. It was orchestrated by Mossad, the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service, and included false flags, literally, and an exchange of ships and cargoes on the high seas. It came to be known as Operation Plumbat, since the illicit cargo was marked as lead. But what that cargo actually contained was an estimated 200 tons of uranium yellowcake. Once the ship docked at Haifa, and this was not the ship that had left the Congo, the uranium was transported to the Dimona reactor site, where the country's nuclear weapons are made. It's quite the story, and I encourage you to look it up. Today, there is renewed interest in the Shinkolobwe mine and its uranium, not for nuclear weapons this time, but to feed the greed for yet more commercial nuclear power plants. China, Russia, and France all have their eyes on the Congo and its uranium, even though at least 6 million people have now died in the genocide there since the late 1990s. The factions and fighting mainly over the rich mineral supplies, these days, most especially cobalt and coltan. Congo's people continue to suffer and die while Western powers greedily eye their mineral riches, just as they did in the 1940s and the 1960s. The people there don't matter and are allowed no voice, in the same way that the citizens of Hiroshima and Nagasaki rose one morning to go about their tasks as on any other day, only to discover that their lives were considered valueless. So when we mourn Hiroshima and Nagasaki today and this week and always, we must remember what their sacrifice represents: a loss of humanity, a loss of empathy, a calculated dehumanization of people painted as other or worse, a willingness to see evil and innocence in the faces of children in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in the Congo, and in Gaza. You don't need a genocidal weapon to carry out a genocide, but the willingness of those who do it and the willingness of those who accept it and who even applaud it, as our Congress did last month, makes all of your voices the voices for peace, the most important voices that need to be heard in our present times. We had our moment of silence, but after that, we must take care of the people of the Congo, Sudan, Gaza, Bangladesh. We must raise our voices again, even louder, and call for decency, for kindness, and for peace. And I will just mention in closing that there have been some extraordinary scenes today that do tie all these stories together at the famous Hiroshima Dome. I can probably share my screen and show you maybe a couple of the pictures, but there's been a demonstration there. It's an anti-war demonstration, but it's also a protest against the presence of Israel at the Hiroshima Nagasaki Memorial. And that's one of the scenes of the crowd there. They've been, I think, fairly violently dispersed now by the police. But that's one picture. There's another one here, I think I can show you. I try and get, oh, sorry, I'm not able to do it because the other one keeps popping back up. But anyway, you get the idea. So that's all I have to say, but I do think that it's important as we think about the past and always remember it, to put it in the context of the present and what it means to treat people as if they're not fellow human beings and what that can lead to. Thank you.